In early December of 1791, famous composer and musician Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was feeling sick. Throughout his life, he had had many different illnesses, from tonsillitis to fevers to different upper respiratory illnesses, but this time, something felt different. Today we're going to be discussing the life and the mysterious death of one of the world's greatest prodigies. Wolfgang was born in Salzburg, Austria on January 27th of 1756. He was one of 7 children, although only he and his sister Nannerl made it past infancy. Wolfgang's father, Leopold Mozart, was a pretty talented violinist and composer, and so naturally both Mozart and his sister started learning and appreciating music at a very young age. Evidently, by the time Wolfgang was 3, he was able to understand things like chords and tempos. By age 4, he was starting to play different pieces, and then by 5, he was already starting to compose his own original material. This kid was extremely gifted. From a young age, Wolfgang was also able to learn different instruments like the viola and the organ and the piano. Leopold, seeing how talented both of his children were, decided that he would take them on 4 separate European tours ranging from the years 1762 to 1771. During these tours, Wolfgang obviously was able to show off his talents, but he was also able to meet more experienced artists and just really hone in on his craft. By the time the boy was 11, he had actually written his first opera, which was called Apollo and Hyacinthus, and by the following year, he had started taking commissions for operas from people like the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II. At age 14, Wolfgang traveled to Italy, where he was able to learn a little bit more and keep composing. Then he moved to Paris for a little bit before finally settling in Vienna at around age 25. These last 10 years of Mozart's life were definitely the busiest. He was continually working on stuff, so he was writing things like symphonies and string quartets, and of course operas as well in both German and Italian. Although his creative genius seemed to be always flowing, by the late 1780s, it just was not paying the bills. Mozart, like all of us, was used to a certain level of comfort, and he wasn't getting commissions like he used to because something called the Austro-Turkish War was going on, so people weren't spending money on things like music and operas and symphonies anymore because they obviously had to focus on the war. Because of this, Mozart and his wife Constance had to move out of central Vienna just to stay afloat. And there are a few diary entries from this time where Mozart talks about how he was plagued with these black thoughts. So it was a really hard time for both him and his wife. But he carried on with his work, and that brings us to September of 1791, when he was at the premiere of his new opera called La Clemenza di Tito in Prague. He was starting to feel kind of sick, and so he wrote a letter to his wife Constance, and he said, "I am only too conscious. My end will not be long in coming. For sure, someone has poisoned me. I cannot rid my mind of this thought." Well, he thought that this would be the end of his song. He actually quickly recovered and got right back to work, and he was writing something called the Requiem. Things were pretty quiet. He was just working on his stuff, but he suddenly became bedridden from an unknown disease on November 20th of 1791. Constance and her sister Sophie took care of Mozart the best they could, staying by his bedside as his symptoms quickly worsened. It started out with a high fever and vomiting. He had this widespread rash around his whole body that was made up of these tiny little red bumps, and he was incredibly swollen, especially around his hands and his feet. He also had a lot of fatigue and body aches. It was just very generalized symptoms of sickness. By this point, Mozart had finished about the first 2 sections of the Requiem and had some of the other parts outlined. But now one of his former students, a composer named Franz Schumacher, took over transcribing the parts of the Requiem as Mozart sang them. It was said that on December 4th of 1791, Mozart was feeling a little bit better and decided to invite a few people over to sing different parts of his Requiem. And it stated that he was actually feeling well enough to sing certain parts by himself. So he wasn't really experiencing any symptoms of like shortness of breath or anything like that. He was feeling well enough to sit up and interact with other people. It's often reported that if people are dying of like terminal illness, or if they're in their old age, sometimes they'll experience a burst of energy called terminal lucidity. This means that if they've been bedridden or if they've been like in and out of consciousness, they'll wake up, they can start walking around, start doing their daily tasks like making dinner or just like running errands or whatever. And this is how a lot of like nurses and people that are in like hospice and stuff know that the patient's about to die. If they've been gradually declining and they suddenly have this burst of energy, this is known as terminal lucidity, and they know that they are not long for the world. Up until this point, Mozart needed help doing the simplest tasks like sitting up in bed. And now suddenly on this day, he was sitting up, he was able to sing and interact with other people very normally. So I think this might have constituted as Mozart's terminal lucidity. So that being said, on the evening of December 4th, Mozart's condition had worsened drastically and the family doctor was called to the home at around 11 p.m. The doctor instructed Sophie to put a cold compress made out of vinegar and cold water on Mozart's forehead, and this started to cause convulsions. This action also caused him to lose consciousness, but Sophie did report around midnight on December 5th, Mozart rose out of bed with his eyes wide open, and then he just laid back down, and around 1 a.m., Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart did pass away. Mozart's doctor originally diagnosed the composer with a disease called, I cannot pronounce this, I'm gonna look at it, Hitzig-Fiesspier. I think it's German. I don't know. Looks like Hitzig-Fiesspier. I usually look up all the pronunciations so I can kind of say them. Couldn't find it. I don't know. I'll put it on the screen. It is also known as a heated military fever. This diagnosis was based on the fact that, of course, Mozart had a very high fever, but he also had that rash, and the bumps were millet seed shaped, and so that's why it's called a heated military fever. Soon after his death, Mozart was buried in a commoner's grave at St. Mark's Church with around 15 to 20 other people, and this was very common at the time. If you weren't like royalty or like if you weren't very wealthy, you were usually buried in a commoner's grave. Although the young composer's life was over, the speculation surrounding his death carried on. Even to this day, there are over 136 different explanations, although most of them don't hold a lot of water. So we're going to be going over a few of these, and I will end with the one that is most widely believed. Just 1 week after Mozart had died, a Berlin newspaper published this article saying that Mozart had been poisoned. And the word on the street was that fellow composer Antonio Salieri had done him in, although this was disproven time and time and time again. The men were basically colleagues, and although they competed over the same commissions at some times, I couldn't find any strong sources that said that they had any ill feelings toward each other. And as these accusations started to come to the light, Antonio himself was like denying them every time because it just simply wasn't true. Even Mozart's doctor came out to the public and was like, I would be able to tell if Mozart was poisoned, and he was not. That being said, the media was hooked on this juicy gossip, even to present day. There is a 1984 movie called Amadeus, which is super good, you should watch it, where it shows Mozart and Salieri as rivals, even up to the very end, and it shows Mozart's death being pinned on Salieri. Now, to be fair, some sources do say that as Salieri aged, he had some bouts of dementia and some mental illness, and so he did at one point confess to poisoning Mozart, but people kind of dismissed it, and I am also dismissing it. We are taking murder off the table. Murder didn't happen. Moving on. One theory that I found, and I have to include because I think it's so interesting, is the idea that Mozart's doctor committed medical malpractice. Mozart's attending doctor was a man named Thomas Franz Closet, and evidently on December 4th, Sophie called for the doctor to come by to Mozart's Vienna apartment because his condition had worsened so quickly. And evidently the doctor didn't come till after 11 p.m. because he was at the theater. And I guess in some sources it was said that Sophie was super pissed. And this is understandable. Like, you're a doctor, you're kind of on call. I feel like in the 1700s, you have to be like on your A game at all times because everybody's dying from everything at all times. A few sources I found also said that the doctor instructing Sophie to put a cold compress on Mozart's head ultimately sent him into shock and made him lose consciousness and ultimately caused his death. But again, like, modern medicine was not a thing. You were probably just like, try this. It's worked before, just try this. And it didn't work, but how was he supposed to know? How was he supposed to know? You know? I don't know. That's just how I feel about the whole situation. Well, Dr. Closet could have hustled a little bit quicker from the theater to Mozart's place. I really don't think anything would have changed the fate of Mozart, so I am taking malpractice off the table for Mozart's death. As medical technology has advanced, different doctors and researchers have tried to figure out what specific disease caused Mozart's passing. Because of the time and traditions, Mozart's body was never preserved, never autopsied, and so researchers have really had to go off simply historical accounts alone. This means that at one point or another, Mozart's death was diagnosed as tuberculosis, mercury poisoning, syphilis, scarlet fever, and even a parasitic worm. Whole spectrum of diseases. But the most widely agreed upon diagnosis for Mozart's death came from a study conducted in 2009. Researchers took the time to dig up all of the death reports in Vienna from December 1791 to January of 1792. And they also took the same report from the year before Mozart's death and the year after it, so they had an accurate depiction of what that singular month looked like in a 3-year span. The team was very surprised to find that during the time of Mozart's death, there was a general increase in the death of young men around Mozart's age. And not only that, but they had very similar symptoms to Mozart's. Armed with all of this knowledge, researchers were able to conclude that Mozart most likely died from a streptococcal infection. Now, of course, if any of us went to the doctor today with like a strep throat type situation, we would get antibiotics and knock that bitch out real quick. But of course, in that time period, Mozart and the other young people experiencing this disease, the infection just continued to spread and it developed into something called nephritic syndrome, which ultimately leads to kidney failure if not treated. And this would explain the body swelling, the fever, and the millet seed rash. More evidence was added to strengthen this claim in 2011 when an article came out stating that vitamin D deficiency could have made Mozart more susceptible to things like streptococcal infections. This is why I love science. Okay, so these researchers, they realized that Vienna is positioned in such a way where the UV rays don't hit very much in the winter months. Not only that, but the young composer was known to be nocturnal. He would write throughout the night, sleep throughout the day, so he really didn't get a lot of sunlight. And as we know, vitamin D, it helps strengthen your immune system and it just makes you a healthier, happier person, both physically and mentally. So the article basically stated that if Mozart would have just been in the sun a little bit more, he might have not developed this streptococcal infection and we might have gotten a couple more bangers out of this amazing composer. It's crazy because a lot of these composers just kind of fade into oblivion, and of course, there are always gonna be the greats. Mozart, he's gonna stay a great. His talent, his genius was beyond compare. I really like this story because although it happened so many years ago, it's a dusty, crusty old story, I think it's still super interesting that this man that was amazing, a prodigy throughout his entire life, he died in such a way that created this whole new whirlwind of craziness around him. Like even in death, he was just this very interesting person, and I think that that's really cool. I hope you guys like these more historical videos. I personally love them. I think that if a story can hold up for over 200-300 years, it's a banger, you know? And although it might be a little like less relatable, I think it's so interesting that researchers can go back and figure out how somebody died retrospectively. That is so cool. I love it. Oh my gosh. But anyway, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment below. Is there a story you want me to talk about? Is there a different crazy death I should be researching that I don't know about? I hope that you guys are enjoying the last little bits and pieces of your summer. I know I am, but I am ready for fall. I have my first little new fall decoration that I bought, and it only gets spookier from here, folks. It's the best time of the year. It's the most wonderful time of the year, I tell you what. I've been working on this really big project for about 6 months now. I'm still in the research phases because I've been slacking on it, but I'm hoping to have it out by the end of October, maybe a little long spooky video for you guys, so you can be looking forward to that. But anyway, I appreciate each and every one of you. Yeah, Keep being the bad bitches that you are, guys. Bye.